We're just talking about how we couldn't make sense of Mario Draghi's comments, whether he was dovish or hawkish, or at least not dovish enough. How about that? What was your sense based on what you heard?
Well, I'd put it more to the dovish side, Scarlet. I think the ECB is in a difficult position, again, like the Fed as well, of having plotted a bit of a course and clearly wanting to slowly move towards some kind of normalization. Suddenly, the script is not actually cooperating. So I think they're making, at least sowing the seeds or planting some of the seeds for a little bit of a pivot. I think that came across a little bit more clearly in the press conference, perhaps in the introductory statement.
Yeah, he sounded pretty forceful in the press conference, but realistically, how much ammunition does really the ECB have, if any, same as the BOJ, left in terms of tools to counteract any sort of downturn?
Well, Caroline, I think that's the big framing issue of the day, that if we step back from these day-to-day movements in the markets, the big question is, what are the lessons from the Great Recession? And some central banks, like the Fed, have been able to normalize a bit, but the Fed itself is undertaking this major review of its policy tools, really motivated by the concern that maybe in the next downturn, monetary policy won't be able to do the job. So I think what is happening at the Fed, they had a big conference yesterday in Chicago, and what we're seeing at the ECB and also at the BOJ, really speaks to a broader conversation that I believe needs to take place, which is not just monetary policy, but the review of the overall macroeconomic policy toolkit. And I think governments and fiscal policy and other policies need to be brought into the picture, because monetary policy is not going to be enough in the next downturn.
That's going to be a little more problematic for the ECB, because you have to herd cats in that regard.
It's hugely problematic, Scarlet, because the ECB, by statute, by constitution, is essentially the only game in town.
So that being the case, do you think Mario Draghi stayed or sounded more neutral for political reasons? His term ends October 31st. He may not want to promise something that his successor can't or won't deliver.
I don't think the politics are per se driving things. I think he will be trying to figure out what is the best thing to do for the ECB. We're talking about trade tensions and whatnot, but don't forget the big shock that may be looming. Layered on top of that, of course, is Brexit, and it's looking with the political developments in the UK that a so-called hard Brexit or no-deal Brexit is looking much more likely than it was a few months ago. That's a shock in the ECB's not just backyard, but also front yard, and not just the trade issues that are being talked about as well.
So you think perhaps Brexit is more systemic than the market is anticipating, that we've all been anticipating? We just look at the pound and sort of then write it off as a UK fiasco.
Well, I mean, the second largest economy in the EU leaving the EU, and we don't know how it's going to do that. We don't actually know whether it's going to do it. Is a huge systemic event, not just for Europe but for the global economy. There's the uncertainty shock associated with this, or the uncertainty drag, if you like, on investment in particular. But nobody knows what's going to happen on the 1st of November, and that's a real issue that. Obviously, it's beyond the control of the ECB.
Sure.
But here's the irony. It's the ECB's job to deal with the macroeconomy. It's the politicians that, in some sense, are failing to lay down the right runway for the ECB to operate on.